Muhammad Ali sat across from Dick Cavett on that fateful night in 1971, and when the question came, the entire studio went silent. Not the polite kind of silence. The heavy kind. The kind where every person in that room knew they were about to witness something they'd never forget. The cameras were rolling. The lights were hot. The audience packed shoulder to shoulder, leaning forward in their seats. Dick Cavett, sharp, composed, known for asking the questions no one else dared to ask, sat comfortably in his chair. But across from him was someone who didn't play by anyone's script. Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer the world had ever seen. The man who'd floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee. The champion who'd been stripped of everything he'd ever worked for. And tonight, he wasn't here to entertain. He wasn't here to put on a show. He was here to speak truth. The kind of truth that made people uncomfortable. The kind of truth that challenged everything America thought it knew about patriotism, courage, and what it really meant to be free. Cavett leaned forward, his voice steady but cutting. Why did you refuse to fight for your country? The question hung in the air like a heavyweight punch frozen in time. And for a moment, just a brief electric moment, Ali said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just sat there, calm, focused, his eyes locked on Cavett's. And then, he spoke. What he said next about Vietnam didn't just shock the audience in that studio. It didn't just shake the millions of Americans watching from their living rooms. It changed everything people thought they knew about him. About the war. About what it means to stand for something when the whole world tells you to sit down. This wasn't a fighter throwing punches. This wasn't a celebrity playing it safe. This was a man who had already lost his title, his freedom, his livelihood, drawing a line in the sand and refusing to cross it, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences, no matter how many people hated him for it. Because what Ali was about to say, on national television, under those bright studio lights, with the entire country watching, would echo through history. It would inspire movements. It would challenge governments. It would force millions of people to ask themselves a question they'd been avoiding. What would I be willing to lose? To stand for what I believe in? Ali had already answered that question. He'd given up his championship belt. He'd been banned from boxing for 3 years, the prime years of his career. He'd faced 5 years in federal prison. He'd been called a traitor, a coward, a disgrace to his country. The government wanted him silent. The media wanted him broken. The system wanted him to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to fall in line like everyone else. But Ali didn't bend, and now sitting in that chair, surrounded by cameras and critics and millions of eyes watching his every move, he was about to explain why. Not with anger, not with bitterness, not with fear, with something far more powerful. With truth, the raw, unfiltered, undeniable truth that would make some people cheer, and others burn with rage. But most importantly, it would make everyone listen. Because when Muhammad Ali spoke, the world had no choice but to pay attention. The Dick Cavett Show, one of the most watched talk shows in America, a platform where intellectuals debated, celebrities promoted their latest projects, and the most fascinating minds of the era came to be seen and heard. The studio was electric that night. The lights were bright, almost blinding under their intensity. The audience was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the back, all of them buzzing with anticipation. Because tonight's guest wasn't just any celebrity. Tonight's guest was the most controversial figure in America. Cameras positioned at perfect angles, ready to capture every expression, every word, every subtle shift in body language. The stage was set like a boxing ring of ideas, 2 chairs facing each other, a small table between them, and nowhere to hide. Dick Cavett sat comfortably in his seat, relaxed but alert. His reputation was built on asking the questions that made people squirm, on pulling truth out of people who'd spent their entire careers avoiding it. He was good at his job, maybe too good, and he knew that tonight he had the interview of a lifetime sitting across from him. Because on the other side of that table sat Muhammad Ali, not just a boxer, not just an athlete, the greatest boxer alive, a man who dazzled the world with his speed, his power, his poetry. "I am the greatest," he declared to anyone who would listen, and he'd proven it again and again and again. But for the past 3 years, Ali hadn't been in the ring. Not because he'd lost, not because he'd retired, because the government had banned him, stripped him of his heavyweight title, the title he'd earned with blood, sweat, and brilliance, took away his boxing license in every state, confiscated his passport so he couldn't fight abroad. All because he'd said two words that changed his life forever. I refuse. Refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War. Refused to put on a military uniform. Refused to go halfway around the world to fight people he had no quarrel with. And for that refusal, America had turned on him. The media called him a coward. Politicians called him a traitor. Former fans burned his posters in the streets. He faced up to 5 years in federal prison. Lost millions of dollars in potential earnings. Became overnight one of the most hated men in the country. But he also became something else. A symbol. To some, a symbol of everything wrong with America's youth. Rebellious, disrespectful, unpatriotic. To others, a symbol of courage. A man willing to sacrifice everything for his principles. And now, 4 years after that fateful decision, here he sat, under those studio lights, in front of those cameras, facing an audience that was split right down the middle, half of them ready to cheer, half of them ready to condemn. The room buzzed with energy, anticipation, tension. You could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Because everyone knew when Ali spoke, the world listened. He didn't just answer questions. He challenged them. He didn't just defend himself. He made you question everything you thought you believed. And tonight, the question everyone wanted answered, the question that had divided dinner tables, sparked protests, and dominated headlines for years, was finally going to be addressed. Why? Why had Muhammad Ali, at the peak of his powers, with everything to lose and nothing to gain, refused to fight in Vietnam? What could possibly be worth giving up everything for? The audience leaned forward. The cameras zoomed in. Dick Cavett prepared his first question, and Muhammad Ali, calm and composed, sat ready to give his answer. Not the answer people wanted to hear, but the answer they needed to hear. The truth. But to understand what Ali was about to say, you have to understand what he'd already lost. You have to understand the weight he'd been carrying, the price he'd already paid. Because this wasn't just about one interview, one question, one moment in time. This was the culmination of years of struggle, years of standing alone, years of watching everything he'd built crumble around him. It started in 1967. Muhammad Ali was 25 years old, at the absolute peak of his career, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. Fast, powerful, untouchable in the ring. He had money, fame, respect from athletes around the globe. The world was his. And then came the letter, the draft notice, report for military service. You're going to Vietnam. For most young men, that letter meant one thing: you go. You don't ask questions. You don't protest. You serve your country, come home, and get on with your life. But Ali looked at that letter and saw something different. He saw hypocrisy. He saw young men, black men, poor men, men with no other options, being shipped off to die in a war they didn't understand. Fighting for a country that wouldn't even treat them as equals when they came home. If they came home. And he couldn't do it. Couldn't put on that uniform, couldn't pretend it was right. So on April 28, 1967 in Houston, Texas, Muhammad Ali refused induction into the United States Army. Not quietly, not privately. In front of cameras, reporters, the whole world watching. He stood there and said the words that would define the rest of his life. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me. Simple words, devastating truth, and America exploded. Within hours, the boxing commissions moved. They stripped him of his title. The World Boxing Association, the New York State Athletic Commission, every major boxing authority in the country, they all revoked his license. He was banned overnight. No fights, no income. No way to do the one thing he'd trained his entire life to do. The government came next, arrested him, charged him with draft evasion. He faced 5 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. 5 years, the prime of his career, gone. The media turned on him viciously. Newspaper headlines called him a disgrace. Radio hosts called him a coward. Television commentators questioned his manhood, his patriotism, his right to call himself American. Former fans burned his pictures, threw away their memorabilia, turned their backs on the man they'd once cheered. He received death threats, hate mail by the thousands. People wanted him dead, wanted him in prison, wanted him erased from history. And the worst part, he couldn't even leave. The government confiscated his passport, so even countries that wanted to see him fight, countries that would have paid him millions, were off limits. He was trapped, banned in his own country, unable to leave, watching his career, his livelihood, his legacy disappear. Athletes he would have dominated retired without ever facing him. Championships were won and lost while he sat on the sidelines. The years ticked by. His prime years. Wasted. While other fighters stayed silent. While other celebrities played it safe. While other public figures kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves, Ali stood alone. He could have apologized. Could have said he made a mistake, that he was young and foolish, that he'd serve his country if they'd just give him another chance. The government would have welcomed him back. The boxing commissions would have reinstated him. The public would have forgiven him. All he had to do was bend. Just a little. Just enough. But Ali didn't bend. He gave speeches on college campuses, spoke at rallies, explained his position over and over again to anyone who would listen. Not with anger, not with bitterness, with clarity, with conviction, with the absolute certainty that what he was doing, what he was sacrificing, was right. He became a symbol for the anti-war movement, for the civil rights movement, for everyone who'd ever been told to sit down and shut up. But the cost was enormous. Financial ruin, public hatred, years of his life he'd never get back, and all the while, the question followed him everywhere: why? Why would you give all this up? Why would you throw away everything you worked for? Why would you choose this path when the easy road was right there in front of you? And now, sitting across from Dick Cavett in 1971, with those cameras rolling and that audience watching, and the whole country waiting for his answer, Muhammad Ali was finally going to explain, not because he owed anyone an explanation, but because the truth, his truth, deserved to be heard. And nothing, not prison, not poverty, not public hatred, was going to stop him from speaking it. Dick Cavett leaned forward in his chair. The moment had arrived. The question that millions of Americans had been asking for 4 years. The question that had divided the nation, sparked protests, ignited debates in every corner of the country. Cavett's voice was steady, measured, but you could hear the weight behind it. Why? Why did you refuse to fight for your country? The question hung in the air. Heavy, loaded, impossible to answer without consequences. The audience held its breath. The cameras zoomed closer. And Ali didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't break eye contact. He simply looked at Cavett, calm, focused, completely in control, and he spoke. His voice was clear, not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? The words landed like punches. Precise, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The studio stayed silent. People shifted in their seats. Some nodded slowly. Others sat stone-faced, jaws tight. But everyone was listening. Ali continued, his tone never wavering. No. I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over. He paused. Let the words sink in. Let them settle into the minds of everyone watching. This wasn't a soundbite. This wasn't a rehearsed speech. This was a man speaking from the core of who he was, from his beliefs, from his soul, and the power in his delivery wasn't in volume or theatrics. It was in the absolute certainty behind every single word. Dick Cavett didn't interrupt. To his credit, he let Ali speak. Let him lay it all out, because even Cavett, sharp interviewer that he was, knew this was a moment that demanded space. Ali kept going. I'm expected to go overseas to help free people in South Vietnam. He shook his head slowly, and at the same time, my people here are being brutalized, killed, denied the right to vote, denied access to decent schools, decent housing, decent jobs. His eyes narrowed slightly. You want me to fight for freedom? Over there. Another pause, when I don't even have it. Over here. He leaned back in his chair. That's a contradiction. The camera stayed on his face, focused, unwavering, and you could see it, the resolve, the peace he'd made with his decision. This wasn't a man defending himself. This wasn't a man trying to win an argument. This was a man who had already walked through the fire, who had already counted the cost, who had already accepted what standing for his principles would mean. And that confidence, that calm, unshakable certainty, was magnetic. Even people watching who disagreed with him couldn't look away, couldn't dismiss him. Because this wasn't coming from a place of fear or anger or ego. This was coming from conviction. Cavett shifted slightly, regrouping. But don't you think you have a responsibility to your country? It was a fair question. The question on everyone's mind. Ali smiled, not a smirk, not condescending, just knowing. like he'd heard that question 1,000 times before, and he had an answer ready. "My enemy is not the Viet Cong," he said quietly. "My enemy is right here." He gestured around him. "The one who won't let me in certain hotels, won't let my kids go to certain schools, won't let me eat at certain restaurants, won't let me live in certain neighborhoods." His voice remained calm, measured, but the truth behind it was undeniable. "You understand what I'm saying?" He leaned forward slightly. "You want me to go fight for that?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge. A challenge to anyone watching to put themselves in his shoes. To imagine being asked to die for a country that wouldn't even treat you as fully human. The studio stayed quiet, not awkward, just heavy. Because in that moment, millions of Americans watching from their living rooms had to confront something they'd been avoiding. Something they'd been taught not to think about. That maybe, just maybe, Ali had a point, and the way he said it, no rage, no bitterness, no hatred, just facts, delivered with the precision of a championship jab, made it impossible to dismiss. Dick Cavett nodded slowly. You could see it on his face, respect, not necessarily agreement, but respect. Because even if you disagreed with Muhammad Ali's stance on the war, even if you thought he was wrong, you couldn't deny his courage. This was a man who had given up everything: money, fame, the prime years of his career, his freedom, because he refused to compromise what he believed. And he wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't begging for approval. He was simply explaining why. But the conversation didn't stop there, because Cavett, like any good interviewer, understood that this moment was too important to let slip away with easy answers. The audience was riveted. The cameras kept rolling. And there were still questions that needed asking, hard questions, the kind that would make Ali dig even deeper. Cavett leaned forward, his expression serious. "Some people say you're being unpatriotic," he said carefully. "That you're a draft dodger, a coward." The words hung in the air, harsh words, ugly words, words that had been thrown at Ali for 4 years, in newspapers, on television, in hate mail, on street corners. The audience tensed. Some leaned forward, eager to hear how Ali would respond. Others sat back, arms crossed, skeptical. Ali didn't blink, didn't get defensive, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Cavett with those steady eyes and spoke. A coward. He let the word sit there for a moment. Let everyone hear how absurd it sounded when you really thought about it. "I'm facing 5 years in prison. Federal prison. I've been stripped of my title, the title I earned. I've lost millions of dollars. I can't work. I can't travel. I can't do the one thing I've trained my entire life to do." He paused, "and I'm still here, standing on what I believe." His voice remained calm, but the power behind it was undeniable. "If I was a coward, I would have went." The words hit like a sledgehammer, because he was right. The easy choice, the coward's choice, would have been to just go along, to put on the uniform, to serve his time, to come back a hero. But Ali had chosen the hard road, the road that led to prison, to poverty, to public hatred. And he'd chosen it with his eyes wide open. The audience stirred. Some nodded in agreement. Others sat stone-faced, unwilling to concede the point. A few whispered to the people next to them. But everyone was engaged. No one in that studio or watching at home was indifferent, because Ali had just flipped the entire narrative. For 4 years, the media had painted him as a man running from responsibility, a celebrity hiding behind his religion to avoid serving his country, a privileged athlete who thought he was above the law. But here he was, on national television, calmly explaining, refusing to go wasn't the easy choice. It was the hardest choice he'd ever made. And then Ali made another point, one that cut even deeper. "You ever notice," he said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "they never asked the people making the wars to fight in them." Cavett raised an eyebrow. The audience leaned in. Ali continued, "The rich folks, the politicians, the people making decisions in Washington." He shook his head. "They don't send their kids to Vietnam. They send poor people, black folks, brown folks, white folks from the countryside who got no other options, no other way out." His hands gestured as he spoke, emphasizing each point. "And meanwhile, the people who benefit from the war, the ones making money off it, the ones whose power depends on it, they stay home. Safe, comfortable." He let that sink in. "You think that's fair?" It was a question most Americans felt in their gut, but rarely heard spoken out loud. Especially not on primetime television. Especially not from someone with a platform as big as Ali's. The truth was uncomfortable. It challenged the narrative they'd been fed. It forced them to ask questions they'd been trained not to ask. Cavett shifted in his seat, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully. You could see the wheels turning. So you think the war itself is wrong? He asked. Ali nodded without hesitation. I think any war where innocent people are dying for politics and profit is wrong. He looked directly into the camera, directly at the millions of people watching. I think any war where young men are being sent to kill and die for causes they don't understand is wrong. His voice softened slightly, but the conviction remained. And I think any country that sends its soldiers to fight for freedom overseas while denying that same freedom to people at home needs to look in the mirror. The camera cut to the audience. The reactions were split. Some faces showed agreement, nodding, eyes bright, clearly moved by Ali's words. Others showed anger, jaw clenched, eyes hard, arms crossed defensively. A few showed confusion, brows furrowed, minds wrestling with ideas they'd never considered before, because Ali wasn't fitting into any box. He wasn't a pacifist, he was a boxer, a fighter by trade. He wasn't anti-American, he loved his country. He was just demanding it live up to its promises. He wasn't hiding, he was standing in the brightest spotlight possible, speaking truth to power. And that complexity, that refusal to be easily categorized, made him dangerous. Because people could dismiss a coward, they could ignore a fool. But they couldn't dismiss a man willing to lose everything for what he believed in. This interview had become something more than just another segment. This was history unfolding in real time, and he had one more question. The question that would crystallize everything Ali had been saying. The question that would give Ali a chance to speak directly to the heart of who he was. Cavett paused, choosing his words carefully. What do you want people to understand about you? The question was simple, but profound, because beneath all the controversy, all the headlines, all the anger and admiration, who was Muhammad Ali really? Ali took a breath. You could see him gathering his thoughts, not searching for the right words to impress, but reaching for the deepest truth he could offer. And then he spoke. I'm not just a boxer, he said quietly. I'm not just a black man. I'm not just a Muslim. He looked directly into the camera, directly at America. I'm a human being, trying to stand for what's right. His voice grew stronger. And if that makes me unpopular, so be it. The audience erupted, not in agreement, not in disagreement, in reaction, applause from some corners, silence from others. A few boos quickly drowned out by the noise, because Ali had just done something radical, something most public figures would never dare to do. He'd refused to be reduced. The media wanted him to be a villain, a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when you step out of line. The government wanted him to be a symbol of disobedience punished, a warning to anyone else who might think about resisting. But Ali looked at all of that and said, no, I'm more than your narrative. I'm more than what you want me to be. And then, he dropped the real bomb. The statement that would echo through that studio and into living rooms across America. The words that would be quoted for decades. You know what the real tragedy is? Ali said, leaning forward now, his voice passionate but controlled. Cavett stayed silent, giving him the floor. It's that young men, black, white, brown, doesn't matter, are dying in a jungle halfway around the world right now. He paused, dying for a cause they don't even understand. Being told they're fighting for freedom, being told they're heroes. His jaw tightened, and back home, he shook his head slowly. The people who sent them there won't even let those same soldiers sit at the same lunch counter as white folks. The silence in the studio was deafening. You send a black man to fight for freedom in Vietnam. Ali's voice rose slightly, the emotion breaking through. Then you tell him he can't be free in Mississippi. You tell him he can't vote in Alabama. You tell him he can't send his kids to a decent school in Georgia. He locked eyes with Cavett. That's not patriotism. A beat. That's hypocrisy. The word landed with devastating force. Dick Cavett sat back in his chair. You could see it on his face. He knew this moment was historic. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a reckoning. Because Ali wasn't just talking about the war. He was talking about America itself. The gap between what it claimed to be and what it actually was. The promise of equality versus the reality of segregation. The rhetoric of freedom versus the practice of oppression. The idea of justice for all versus the truth of justice for some. And millions of people watching, in their homes, in bars and living rooms across the country, had to confront that gap, had to sit with that uncomfortable truth. Soldiers watching from military bases, parents watching with sons overseas, protesters watching from college dorms, politicians watching from offices in Washington. All of them forced to grapple with what Ali had just laid bare. And then Ali said something that still resonates today, something that transcended the specific moment and spoke to something timeless. "I'm not angry at America," he said, his voice softening. "I love America." He let that sit. "That's why I want it to be better." A pause. Real patriotism isn't blind loyalty. He pointed to his chest. It's holding your country accountable. It's demanding that it live up to what it says it believes in. The camera stayed on him. No theatrics, no performance. Just a man speaking his truth, raw, honest, unfiltered. And in that moment, something incredible happened. Even people who disagreed with him couldn't help but respect him. Because Ali had done what so few people have the courage to do. What so few people are willing to risk everything for. He stood alone. When the world turned its back. When the money dried up. When the government threatened him with prison. When former friends abandoned him. When the media crucified him. He didn't break. He didn't apologize. He didn't bend. He stood firm. And that is true strength. After the interview aired, the reaction was explosive. Phone lines at the network lit up. Letters poured in by the thousands. Some called Ali a hero, a voice for the voiceless. A man brave enough to say what millions were thinking but too afraid to speak. Others called him a traitor, a disgrace, someone who should be locked up and silenced forever. The country was divided, sharply, bitterly. But here's what no one could deny. Ali had sparked a conversation that America desperately needed to have. About war, about race, about freedom, about what it really means to serve your country, about whether blind obedience is the same thing as patriotism. And slowly, the tide began to turn. More athletes started speaking out. Basketball players, football players, baseball players who'd been silent before suddenly found their voices. More celebrities used their platforms. Musicians, actors, writers who realized they didn't have to just entertain. They could challenge, they could question, they could demand better. More everyday people began to question the war. Families gathered around dinner tables and asked, "Why are we really there?" Students organized on college campuses. Veterans came home and told the truth about what they'd seen. The anti-war movement grew stronger. And at the center of it all, whether people admitted it or not, was the example Muhammad Ali had set. The example of standing for something even when it cost you everything. In 1971, the same year as this interview, the Supreme Court overturned Ali's conviction, unanimously, ATO. He was freed, the threat of prison lifted, his name cleared, and in 1974, in Kinshasa, Zaire, Muhammad Ali did the impossible. He faced George Foreman in the legendary Rumble in the Jungle. Foreman, younger, stronger, undefeated, terrifying. Everyone said Ali was too old, too slow, finished. But Ali knocked him out in the 8th round, reclaimed his title, proved he was still the greatest. The crowd went wild, the world celebrated. But the real victory, it wasn't in the ring. It was in the fact that Ali had proven something more powerful than any championship belt could represent. You can lose everything and still win. Because winning isn't always about titles or money or fame. Sometimes, winning is about standing for what you believe in, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. Sometimes winning is about looking yourself in the mirror and knowing you didn't compromise who you are. And history proved Ali right. Today, the Vietnam War is widely seen as a tragic mistake, a war built on lies, thousands of American lives lost, millions of Vietnamese lives destroyed, families torn apart, a nation divided, and the man who refused to fight in it. The man they called a coward, a traitor, a disgrace. He's remembered as a hero, not because he was perfect, not because everyone agreed with him, but because he had the courage to stand, to risk everything for his principles, to say no when the entire weight of the government, the media and public opinion was crushing down on him. In his own words he spoke many times throughout his life. "I know where I'm going and I know the truth, and I don't have to be what you want me to be. I'm free to be what I want." That's the lesson. That's what this interview, and Ali's entire life, was really about. You don't have to fit into anyone's box. You don't have to bend to pressure. You don't have to sacrifice your beliefs for approval or acceptance or an easier path. True freedom isn't just about rights on paper. It's about having the courage to live according to your conscience, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Ali did that, and because of it he changed the world, Not with violence, not with hate, not with bitterness or revenge, with words, with truth, with conviction. So the next time you're faced with a choice between doing what's easy and doing what's right, remember Muhammad Ali. Remember the man who gave up his title, his money, his freedom, and never once regretted it. Because in the end, what matters isn't what the world thinks of you. It's what you think of yourself. And Ali, he could look at himself in the mirror and smile. Strength isn't about hurting others. It's about standing for what's right, even when you stand alone. More powerful stories like this are coming. Drop a comment and tell us which part of Ali's story hit you the hardest. Let us know so we can bring you even better content.